Bulgaria today is a small Balkan country, situated next to the Black Sea. Despite Westerners viewing it as just another Balkan or Eastern European state, the Bulgarians have a long and complicated history, and their influence has had lasting consequences on its neighbors and beyond. Bulgaria was conquered by the Ottoman Turks in the late Middle Ages, only wresting its independence some 500 years later. But before then, it was a powerful empire that dominated the Balkans, rivaling the Byzantine Empire. Culturally speaking, Bulgaria's liturgical tradition was responsible for the development and spread of Cyrillic script, nowadays used in other countries like Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. The Bulgarians speak a Slavic language, but, oddly enough, borrowed their name from an upper class of nomadic invaders, the Bulgars, who subjugated the regional Slavs in the 7th century. These Bulgars came from the basin of the Volga River and were part of a much larger people. Upon the Volga, the remaining Bulgars established a powerful state, serving as a trade link between the north and south. Their primary trade goods were furs and slaves, specifically white European slaves called sakaliba by the Muslim buyers of the south. The Bulgar kings were so dominant in the slave market that the Muslims called them King of the Sakaliba. This semi-nomadic state lasted for almost 600 years, and despite never becoming more than a regional power, was one of the longest-lasting and successful states of the Eurasian steppe, even managing to temporarily beat back the Mongols, and whose legacy can still be seen today. It must be understood that, unlike the modern Bulgarians, the early medieval Bulgars were not one single people, but a tribal confederacy of various Hunnic, Turkic, and Iranian groups, speaking different languages. Indeed, the word Bulgar means mixed ones in Turkic. In the aftermath of the Hunnic invasions, they migrated from modern Kazakhstan into what is now southern Russia and eastern Ukraine. Here they divided themselves into two groups, the Utigurs and the Kutrigurs. The presence of nomads posed a serious threat to Byzantine possessions on the Crimean Peninsula, and the empire would throughout its existence make local alliances to deploy as proxies against potential threats. They did this with the Khazars, with the Rus, and in the 6th century, with the Utigurs. The Bulgars spent most of the 550s in civil war. This division made them susceptible to outside forces. The Kutrigurs were defeated and absorbed by the Avars around 560, and in the late 6th century, the remaining Bulgars and their territories were subjugated by the Western Turkic Khaganate. In 635, a member of Clan Dulo, Kubrat, overthrew the Avars with Byzantine assistance. Khan Kubrat carved out a new state along the Don, Kuban, and Dnipro rivers, known as Great Bulgaria. His capital lay in Phanagoria on the Taman Peninsula, and maintained diplomatic and commercial ties to Khwarezm, Sogdiana, and Persia. But when Kubrat died in 642, Great Bulgaria was divided among 3 of his sons. Chaos in the wider Turkic Khaganate soon made the empire fall apart, allowing another tribe, the Khazars, to rise up and conquer some of the remnants. A new dominion was carved out in the northern Caucasus, and Great Bulgaria was subjugated. The 3rd son of Kubrat, Asparuk, gathered his people and migrated westward. Entering the fertile Balkans, they settled on the island of Pevka in an estuary of the Danube, from whence they would conquer the surrounding Slavic lands and establish what would become the modern country of Bulgaria. Over the generations, the ruling Bulgars would mix with their Slavic subjects, eventually assimilating and adopting Orthodox Christianity in 864. Only a few Turkic words remain in the Bulgarian language, nowadays more similar to Serbian, Croatian, and Russian. Some of the Bulgars would remain in the Don steppe and become known as Black Bulgars. The rest, led by Kotrag, the 2nd son of Kubrat, crossed the Don and resettled in the east. In the 8th and 9th centuries, they migrated once more to the confluence of the Volga and Kama rivers. They subjugated the native Uralic peoples and established a new power, which would persist for the coming 500 years. Volga-Bulgaria had been born. But the road to civilization was long, and the Bulgars had much work ahead of them. There isn't much known about the early development of the Volga-Bulgarian state. The written sources don't care about them before the 10th century, and the archaeological remnants are ambiguous and relatively few. But there are a few things that we do know. The Bulgars were the dominant regional power, controlling a territory roughly stretching from the Volga to the Oka River. They consisted of three main groups, the Barsula, Eskel, and Bulgar, ruled by a king and 500 powerful families. Below them were a subjugated population of Bashkirs, Ugrians, and Slavs. These peoples did not pay a tribute in food, but furs, the precious skins of animals like the beaver, fox, and marten. As a subject of the Khazars, the Bulgars had to annually pay them 1 pelt per household. These furs were highly sought after in the Mediterranean and Middle East, and the most precious commodity of a trade route connecting Spain with Russia. But the land was rich in other products. Muslim sources listed a vast amount of exports, including but not limited to wax, honey, hazelnuts, tall fir caps, arrows, birch and maple wood, and a number of goods likely bought from Viking traders, falcons, amber, and swords. These swords were most likely Carolingian swords. They were favored by the Vikings and brought on the trade expeditions to the east. Trade allowed for the Bulgar Khan to supply his warriors with the best of weapons and armor. The Bulgars would quickly note the value of slaves. Being nomadic horse warriors, they were able to swiftly ride into settled villages, murder those who resisted, and drag off the rest into slavery. The captives were then herded down into Khazaria, where Jewish merchants called Radhanites would sell them off in the Islamic Caliphate. The Caliphate had been in contact with Khazaria almost since the foundation of Islam. Though relations were initially hostile, there was a shift towards peace and trade in the late 9th century. Now, the Khazars weren't exactly traders or producers themselves, as much as they were mediators between the Mediterranean markets and the fur-producing lands of the north. Thus, the commerce attracted Islamic attention to Volga-Bulgaria, and vice versa. The Khazars had converted to Judaism, likely to stratify themselves as a third party between Christian Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphate, so the pagan Bulgars were seen as a potential ally. Around the Volga-Bulgars, the 9th century was especially dynamic. It saw the rise of the Rus and Viking traders, and the Khazarian conversion to Judaism. Trade increased, and the influx of ideas seems to have impacted change in Volga-Bulgaria. Sometime in the early decades, the nomadic Bulgars began settling down as farmers. It is not entirely certain why. It could have been because climate change made nomadism difficult, or because the Bulgars had become comfortable in their position upon the river, from which they could control trade and collect tribute. They sowed and harvested corn such as grain, barley, wheat, and millet, but some sources reflect an incompetence in the practice. They would store the grain in pits where it would rot, and in order to become a civilization, Volga-Bulgaria was dependent on outside knowledge. Though close contact was maintained with Khazaria, many of their ideas would also come from the Islamic world. The first Muslims to have settled in Volga-Bulgaria appear to have been refugees, pushed out of Khazaria after the religious conflict caused by the state conversion to Judaism. The new religion proved appealing to the regular people of Volga-Bulgaria, and even though the government remained pagan, most of the regular people had converted to Islam by the end of the 9th century. They had constructed wooden mosques, but didn't know how to properly say the prayers. They were still clinging on to haram customs. The women wouldn't wear the veil and bathed naked together with the men, shamelessly in the river. Most of them were now farmers, but they lived in tents in unfortified settlements. Perhaps the people pressured the government to convert, or the king himself realized the benefits of the prophet's creed. Around the year 920, the king of the Bulgars, called Almish ibn Shilki Yiltawar, requested the caliph to instruct him in the faith, teach him the laws of Islam, build a mosque, and erect a minbar. so a delegation was sent into the land of darkness, among whom was a traveler named Ahmad ibn Fadlan. He left behind a famous written account, which included a description of the Rus Vikings and their customs. But his most extensive musings came in regards to the Bulgars. I previously mentioned how one of the Bulgar exports included tall fur caps. This was part of the winter dress code. They also wore long fur coats with belts at the waist, and had a custom of shaving most of their hair, except for a portion tied in a pigtail. The women wore wide breeches and girdles, with ornaments made from iron, glass, copper, and bone. They also had a taste for different alcohols unique to the region. Suju was a type of mead, which had only been fermented for 1 day and a night. They would also make alcohol from birch sap, drunk inside of their homes. The Bulgars lived in tents, presumably yurts. The king's tent was especially large, apparently able to house 1,000 people. It was spread with Armenian carpets, and his throne stood in the center, covered with Byzantine brocade. The Bulgar elite must have been prosperous, as Fadlan described the king as a fat man with a large belly. Upon converting to Islam, he took on the name of Jafar and assumed the title of Amir. However, his reasons for converting had been Jafar from genuine. For one, he thought he was going to get paid for it. More interestingly, he expected Ibn Fadlan's assistance in raising a fortress to protect the Bulgars from the Khazars. Even though the Bulgars and Khazars had an amicable relationship, it seems that the Bulgars wished to be independent. Far-flung commerce had made them prosperous, and the tribute payment to Khazaria was becoming a nuisance. Islam thus became a means to develop a separate identity from Jewish Khazaria, gain new allies, and also to introduce new customs and technology. Most importantly, urbanization. Evidence for early urbanization in the 9th century can be found in archaeological remnants. Craft and trade hubs appeared in the settlements of Bulgar, Bilyar, Suvar, Kazan, and Yokotin. The modern cities of Kazan and Yelabuga were initially founded as Bulgar fortresses. In the 10th century, the expanding agriculture allowed these settlements to blossom into full-blown cities. Bilyar was known as the Great City in Rus chronicles, because by the 11th century, its populace had grown to 100,000, an impressive amount in the Middle Ages, let alone the Eurasian steppe. In the 10th century, the populations of the towns would have been more modest, but still very high when compared to their neighbors. Crafts in these settlements included glass-blowing, jewelry, and pottery. Unlike the Khazars, who were mostly taking advantage of geography to profit from trade, the Bulgars were also able to produce natural and industrial goods, deciding commerce. Their trade economy was thus very flexible. The wealth of commerce and Islamic contact allowed the Bulgars to invest in construction, and they would become renowned architects, decide in Rus and Central Asia. Their cities were home to prominent mosques, public baths called hammam, and houses of learning. Indeed, Volga-Bulgaria became a scholastic center. Here resided writers and researchers like the historian Yakub ibn Noman al-Bulgari, who wrote a history of the Bulgars in 1112, or the poet Kulgali, author of A Tale About Yusuf, composed in 1212. Some of their buildings, including mosques and the tomb of a Khan, remain standing to this day. With the assistance of foreign allies, Arabs, and possibly a couple of Rus, these settlements were fortified. Defenses consisted of deep, triangular moats, the slopes furnished with timber, stabilizing the earth and making them difficult to climb. Above the moat stood a wooden palisade, behind which the defenders could work with bows and arrows. The Bulgars also worked with stone and brick. In 985, they constructed a border fortress of Alabuga. Remnants of it can still be seen today, in the form of the Devil's Tower. The castles were nothing without the men to man them, and commerce allowed the Khan to maintain a powerful military. It was based on the Rus Drushina, and consisted of two wings called the Hashun and Hiane. The former were private guards of the Khan, and the latter were a military retinue. They were in turn supported by urban militias, Rus mercenaries, the forces of vassals, and levied warriors from subordinate tribes. The Bulgar Drushina had access to the best of weapons and armor. These included the saber iconic to the Khazars and other Turks, but also Carolingian swords imported via the Vikings. Made in the Rhineland area of Germany, they were heavy, double-edged blades with large, distinctively shaped hilts, and sometimes inscribed with Latin letters, one with the name Ulfbert. The Bulgars also made use of spears, axes, and maces. As nomads, they were both excellent archers and horsemen. Most iconic were the conical helmets, supplied with a facial mask. Mail shirts were the most common armor. The evolution of Volga-Bulgaria was a cyclical process. Commerce allowed for urbanization, fortification, and an expanded military, all of which further expanded trade and allowed the Bulgars to become more independent from their Khazarian overlords. This can best be seen in the early 10th century, when the Bulgars began minting their own silver coins. Silver coins were the most important import, being a universally recognized currency, and vital for the gift-giving economy of Scandinavia. Around the same time, the silver trade was slowing down in Khazaria. I've talked about this in multiple of my videos. It is uncertain what exactly caused it, but it led to a decline of Khazaria as a power, and caused a rift between the Rus and Khazars. The Rus and the tradesmen of Central Asia began instead to look to the Bulgars as the new middleman of the region, circumventing the Khazars entirely. By now, Bulgar had become strong enough to defend itself against possible Khazar incursions. But no such thing happened. The Khazars were busy with the Pechenegs and Rus, and the Bulgars would continue to pay tribute until the fall of Khazaria. The neighboring Rus were reliant on commerce to maintain their relevance, and unlike the Bulgars, used aggression to expand their territory and interest. When the Khazars became a hindrance, Knyaz Sviatoslav invaded in 962, toppling the Judaic Empire and opening up the trade with the East. After conquering Khazaria, Sviatoslav turned next on the Bulgars. According to the primary chronicle, he conquered the capital of Bulgar, but it doesn't seem as if he subjugated them as hard as his other opponents, as the emirate continued as a strong, independent power. In 985, the son of Sviatoslav, Vladimir, considered an attack on the Bulgars to expand his tributaries. His confidant, Dobrynya, warned against it. According to legend, he said, "I have seen the Bulgar prisoners, who all wear boots. They will not pay us tribute. Let us rather look for foes with bast shoes." Boots were cavalry equipment, whereas bast shoes were worn by peasants. Basically, Dobrynya said that the Bulgars were powerful, mounted warriors, and would be difficult to subjugate, compared to the lesser tribes. Peace was made with the Bulgars, who attempted to cement their friendship by converting Vladimir to Islam. According to the primary chronicle, the idea of being given 70 beautiful women in the afterlife was appealing to Vladimir. He was fond of, quote, women and indulgence. Less appealing were the ideas of circumcision and abstinence from pork and wine. "Drinking," said he, "is the joy of the Russes. We cannot exist without that pleasure." 1,000 years and some things just haven't changed. Even still, relations between Rus and Volga-Bulgaria would remain largely friendly. In 1006, an agreement was signed allowing Rus merchants to trade freely into Bulgar cities along the Volga and Oka rivers. This became of life and death importance in 1024, when Rus was struck by famine and had to import grains from the Bulgars. Indeed, farming in Volga-Bulgaria, once home of nomads, had now become very advanced. Intermarriage between the neighbors was common, and sometimes cross-conversion. Vladimir converted to Christianity to gain an ally in Byzantium, and in 990 sent a Greek missionary to Volga-Bulgaria. 4 of their princes converted and resettled in Rus. The following 2 centuries were relatively stable for Volga-Bulgaria, compared to the bouts of chaos in Rus. For the most part, the two would be at peace, but disputes would intermittently break out between them, primarily regarding the collection of tribute from the fur-hunting tribes of the forest. The Bulgars attacked Rus in 1088, 1107, 1152 and 1209. The Russes would retaliate in return, with neither gaining a significant advantage. Prince Andrei Bogolubsky was an especially notable prosecutor of Bulgars, despite being married to a Bulgar woman. In 1174, she assisted several courtiers in assassinating him. Volga-Bulgaria is a very fascinating country. It controlled a smaller territory than the Rus or Khazars, but it was much more densely populated, with each city having a population that could rival some of the Middle Eastern centers. They weren't expansionist, but had a large army to defend their borders, and to carry out offensive operations to keep their neighbors in check. They were cultural, educated, self-sufficient, and wealthy. It was one of the most prosperous and stable dominions of the Eurasian steppe, and there really was no reason for them to collapse. Then came the reason: the Mongols. Led by Subutai and Jeb, the Mongol army headed north into Volga-Bulgaria, having defeated the Russes and Kipchaks in 1223. Subutai is regarded as one of history's greatest military commanders, and at this point, the Mongols thought themselves invincible. In desperation, the Bulgar king, Gabdullah Chelbir, allied with two Mordvian princes, Puresh and Purgas, and staged an ambush against the Mongol forces. The trap was sprung at a significant bend in the Samara River. The combined force attacked the Mongol vanguard. Following a series of hard-fought skirmishes, the Mongols fled. According to anti-Mongol sources, only 4,000 Mongols remained, but these numbers are up to debate. On his way back to Mongolia, Subutai was able to subjugate a Kipchak tribe, so he likely had the soldiers to do so. Nevertheless, the Volga-Bulgarians and their Ugric allies had achieved the impossible. Despite facing imminent doom, the Rus believed the Mongols to just be another nomadic incursion. They had faced and defeated these since the 900s, including the Pechenegs, Khazars, Cumans, and Kipchaks. So, wishing to establish supremacy in the region, they attacked Volga-Bulgaria, severely weakening both countries. In 1229, the Mongols returned. They first defeated the Bulgar frontier guards, patrolling the mountains of the Ural River. 3 years later, they subjugated the Bashkirs and large areas of the Bulgar territory, but were unable to conquer the cities themselves. Consequently, Karakorum decided to divert some of its best generals from China and the Middle East to finally subjugate this trifling emirate. With an army 300,000 strong and a significant siege train, Batu Khan led the attack in 1236. The cities of Bilyar, Bulgar, Suwar and Shukatau were swiftly toppled, the fortifications falling one by one. The inhabitants were massacred or sold into slavery. According to historians, 80% of the country's population were killed or displaced. When the dust had settled, the shattered remnants were handed over to Yotchi, son of Genghis Khan and ruler of the Golden Horde. Thus ended the civilization of Volga-Bulgaria. But the survivors would merge with the conquerors, and from the ashes would rise a new people to claim the legacy of the old Khanate. Identifying themselves as Tatars, they redeveloped agriculture and established new cities, most prominent being the city of Kazan. This city-state became an independent power in 1437, before finally being conquered by Ivan Grozny in 1531. Since then, Kazan and the legacy of Volga-Bulgaria has been part of Muscovy. Today, Kazan is the capital of Tatarstan, one of the republics of the Russian Federation. If you want to support Stearman, you can do so monetarily via the Patreon link in the video description. Otherwise, give the video a like and a comment, and if you want to see more videos in the future, subscribe and click the notification bell. The bell is very important, because YouTube is otherwise reluctant to actually show you the videos. Please enjoy, and I'll see you again soon.